I am ready to learn.
I'm ready. I'm not ready.
After several years of playing Hearthstone, I'm still at odds with how I think about the RNG factor in this game, and it doesn't look like its prevalence is going to disappear anytime soon. I made a video a while back on what RNG is, but since then there have been some changes to how it affects Hearthstone, and how we as players can take advantage of it. RNG stands for Random Number Generator, which, to the average player, probably means absolutely nothing out of context. Simply, it acts as a risk-reward system in this online card game. Its definition, as Wikipedia states, is a computational device or algorithm that creates a sequence of numbers or symbols that cannot be reasonably predicted. In other words, as long as there are enough unpredictable outcomes in a consistent manner, it's considered random. As a result of new mechanics introduced by new expansions to the game, several new editions of RNG have been implemented. Hearthstone has one overarching type of RNG, but it can be broken down into more specific types. Deck Drawing RNG refers to the randomness of drawing cards from your deck. Certain minions like Malorn and spells like Gang Up utilize this RNG by inserting cards directly into your deck. The fewer cards left in your deck, the higher the chances of drawing a specific card. The jousting mechanic uses this form of RNG and can be adjusted depending on how many cards there are left in your deck and which cards you've drawn or haven't drawn already. Card Discard RNG is the simplest form of RNG meant to add a punishment mechanic to certain cards like Doomguard and Soulfire, which have already overpowered stats for their cost, and this punishment can only be taken from your hand, which gives you much more control over which cards will be discarded. If you hold no cards, you receive no punishment, because this punishment mechanic is contingent on you holding cards. Value RNG selects a quantity from a relatively small pool of numbers to determine the magnitude of either damage or buffs applied to the board. Examples of this are Lightning Storm, Implosion, and the Boom Bots from Dr. Boom. The main distinction of this RNG is that it is not determining whether an action will happen, but at what value an action will happen as. In other words, you are guaranteed some benefit, but the magnitude of that benefit is varied. All three of these forms of RNG can be relegated to what is known as pool selection RNG, where an action is being taken upon a specific pool of cards or values. This can vary from a massive pool, like with Unstable Portal, drawing from a source that inhabits more than 70% of the entire card pool, to a very small source, for example with the Knife Juggler, only being able to select at most 1 out of 8 targets, including the enemy hero. And that pretty much goes over all of the RNG in Hearthstone, which is all fine and dandy, but the main goal of understanding this is so that we as players can take advantage of the RNG and make favorable, calculated decisions, especially when slightly new RNG mechanics are being introduced into the game with each expansion. Like I mentioned before, RNG's main purpose in a card game like Hearthstone should be to inspire risk in the game. And this is what makes randomness an extremely lucrative mechanic. Most people look at RNG as just another way to cause volatility in the game, but there's a way of using it that can enhance the experience and make it much more strategic. That's right, I said it. RNG can make a game more strategic when implemented properly. Risk creates a scenario where a player has to make a decision, and making decisions is what strategy is all about. So what cards in Hearthstone emphasize RNG in a good way, and which cards don't? The most obvious contenders for RNG being used in an antithetical way are Unstable Portal and Piloted Shredder, because these cards do not in any way inspire risk. The Unstable Portal adds a minion to your hand that costs 3 less mana. So if you get a card that costs 3 mana, its cost will change to 0, thus allowing you to play a 3 mana card on turn 2. If you receive a card that costs more than 3 mana, then you will have received, in most cases, a really good card for a discount mana cost, having sacrificed 2 mana for a 3 mana discount. This card has virtually no risk in terms of tempo, and does not require any form of decision making to play apart from playing it on turn 2 or not, even though it has RNG attached to it. This is why, when it was released, Unstable Portal found its place in so many mage decks at the time, and even now remains one of the most highly sought after cards in many mage decks. It contradicts the very essence of what RNG is meant to accomplish, inspiring a parallel relationship between risk and reward. There is no risk here, only high reward. And the same goes for the Piloted Shredder, and this is why this card inhabits almost every new deck out there. For 4 mana, you receive a 4/3 card that dies and gives you a random 2 mana card directly on the field. So you're effectively getting 6 mana worth of value for 4 mana, or your opponent has to expend at least 2 mana to silence it. In the end, this card, like Unstable Portal, has virtually no risk involved. If I can, I'm going to play the Piloted Shredder on turn 4 no matter what the situation, and that's not a good thing in this game. This inherent lack of decision making is what makes this card and others like it not very interesting and extremely frustrating to play against. If you want some examples of RNG done right, offering high risk, high reward as it should, the discard cards from the Warlock class are well designed, especially since there is a way to negate the RNG by simply having no cards in your hand, which is a secondary layer of risk and reward. There's great risk involved in losing random cards, but the effects that you receive from the cards played are equally powerful. If you're holding a Doomguard and Power Overwhelming in your hand and your opponent has less than 9 health left, do you play the Doomguard and risk discarding your Power Overwhelming? Is there a safer path to victory from the options coming from the rest of your hand? There's a lot of strategic depth here where Piloted Shredder is clearly lacking. Some neutral minions with good RNG include the Mad Bomber, Demolisher, and Ragnaros. These are great examples where the rewards and risks are comparable according to their cost. The reason why many of these cards are not used in popular decks is because when you have cards like Piloted Shredder and Unstable Portal where the RNG is virtually risk-free, why would you even think of putting cards that have an equal magnitude of risk and reward into your deck? I'd like to mention that the recently introduced discovery mechanic is a wonderful middle ground between player choice and RNG, and I would encourage Blizzard to find methods of employing RNG like the discovery mechanic to this game. There are a handful of discovery cards that have stats and effects that could be put on the Piloted Shredder tier list, but all in all, the mechanic itself is fresh, and that's something that Hearthstone really needed. For now, there are some rules to the implementation of RNG that I think should be considered. For one, RNG should have some level of risk-reward ratio where one of these factors is known and the other is contingent on calculated randomness. Secondly, RNG should scale with greater magnitudes of risk-reward the higher the mana cost, rather than the other way around. And thirdly, RNG should be used as a negative to offset more powerful attributes or abilities, not just as a promotional stunt for exciting games. At the end of the day, RNG is about providing an opportunity to seize an advantage for an unknown risk. It's this risk that makes randomness exciting and nerve-wracking at the same time. The reason why a lot of players are so frustrated with RNG is because it feels like the game is dictating the direction of a match, rather than the player skillfully making a decision to risk RNG or not. This mechanic is set up to be a risk factor mechanic, but right now, it just feels like the environment is playing the game for you. I'm not saying that the cards with randomness shouldn't provide strong incentives, but when there's no risk involved with playing them, there's no point in having RNG apart from making the game excessively volatile. Of course, if you're looking for a deck that's entirely void of randomness, might I suggest Handlock, as the only random element in this deck is Dr. Boom, which is one of those cards that uses randomness in a virtually no-risk, high-reward way. Although, with that being said, in an environment where RNG can be easily exploited, perhaps it's better to join them if you can't beat them.